Right, good evening those who've recently come and those who were here before. Welcome to the second part of this evening's entertainments. I'm sure the AGM was thrilling enough, but even now we come on to the meat of the evening, which is the lecture. Now, in the past, because I've been around for a few years, when I first became involved in the Institute, it used to be called the British Institute of Archaeology in Ankara, and archaeology was its main theme. But for a variety of reasons, and I think entirely correctly, over the last 25 years, as many of the institutes abroad, such as School at Athens and Rome and the BIAA, as we call them, supported by the British Academy, we broadened our range of academic interests. So now we have assistant director who's concerned with cultural heritage, and Daniel, who is the current assistant director in Ankara, who is concerned with Ottoman and contemporary Turkey, and his research, which he'll be talking about this evening, is concerned with the period during and after the First World War. And this builds on a series of themes that the Institute has been working on for the last decade, working with Turkish colleagues and British colleagues, from enemies to allies. Is that right? Yes. Yes, I'm never quite sure. So I'm the wrong way around. Never mind. Which Stephen Mitchell initiated. So I'm very pleased this evening that Daniel will present for those of you who weren't here earlier, this is his book, which I understand you can purchase at the end or can order at the end. And there are some other publications, again, which he's been involved with, which, again, are available. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Daniel to talk to us about Britain on the Bosphorus. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jim. Thanks also for the advertisement for the book. It's a bit cringy when you try and sell your own book. The title, as you can see, Britain on the Bosphorus, was also actually the title of my master's thesis, which I completed back in 2009. And this thesis looked at British discourse about Istanbul during its occupation by Allied forces from November 1918, after the Ottoman Empire's defeat in the First World War, until October 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the new state and borders of Turkey. And the thesis marked the beginning of my academic engagement with Turkey. I'd actually previously studied, for my undergraduate thesis, Anglo-Greek relations, but I'm happy to have made the switch. Now later, the master's was developed into probably an overly ambitious doctoral project, which compared the British occupation of Istanbul with that in Alexandria, Egypt, and Thessaloniki in Greece. Perhaps because it was such a wide-ranging book, it took me 6 or 7 years to get it published, which involved a lot of additional research and revision. It finally came out in 2021. And in this lecture, I'm going to provide some essential background information on the occupation, which is not extremely well known, and as well as introducing two of the main themes of the book, before considering the challenges and politics of writing or otherwise investigating this period of Turkish history at the present time. The book's publication owes a lot to the British Institute at Ankara, so I'm really pleased to be giving this lecture. Much of the additional research that I couldn't complete as a PhD student was carried out as a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute between 2014 and 2017, and I finally finished editing the final draft of the manuscript during the COVID lockdown that hit just after I'd been appointed assistant director. My interest was drawn to the occupation of Istanbul because of its obscurity, which seemed and continues to seem entirely out of proportion with its significance. as someone who at that time had just completed an undergraduate degree in history. I was surprised that I'd never heard of this nearly 5-year occupation of one of the world's major cities. The broader story of the transformation of Turkey from an empire to a republic in these years is a topic of major academic and popular interest, but few of these works give significant focus to the place of Istanbul and its occupation, instead preferring an Anatolia-focused narrative of the national struggle that closely follows the itinerary and actions of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And the fact that British policy towards Turkey in this crucial period remains overlooked in the UK, while it's widely discussed and debated within Turkey, is a recipe for misunderstanding and sometimes indignation. Of course, the extent of Britain's global influence and interference in these years means it is difficult to assign each intervention appropriate attention. And it's worth remembering that at the same time that Britain was occupying Istanbul, it was intervening against Bolshevik Russia, losing a war of independence in Ireland, establishing control in Palestine, suppressing a revolution in Egypt, crushing rebellions in newly acquired territories in Mesopotamia, massacring protesters at Amritsar in British India. There was a lot going on. And as a result, we can think about these years after the war, 1918 to 23, as what Keith Jeffrey calls a crisis of empire. Everywhere in all of these examples, you see how the expansion, intensification, and militarization of colonial rule that had followed Britain's entry into the First World War had become unsustainable. London's lack of focus on Istanbul and Turkey was widely complained about by the British officers and officials on the ground. Britain's High Commissioner, first High Commissioner in Istanbul, as the ambassador for these 5 years was known, Admiral Calthorpe, described his policy there as, to quote, a series of makeshifts. And Britain's most senior military officer, General Charles Harrington, who's photographed between his French and Italian counterparts on the slide, wrote bitter letters at the end of the occupation decrying the policy of drift that had prevailed in London. Among the reasons for this drift was disagreement within the British cabinet and with Britain's allies on how to dispose of Istanbul. When the war broke out with the Ottoman Empire in November 1914, after a failed attempt to keep the Turkish government neutral, it forced a re-evaluation of British strategy. Though Britain had been happy to take Ottoman provinces like Cyprus and Egypt into its control in the 19th century, it always sought to maintain Ottoman sovereignty over its core territories. But the outbreak of the war changed this. And soon the capital and control of the straits, the waterways in Istanbul, were promised to Russia, while Britain and France focused their ambitions on the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces. That deal was voided by the Bolshevik Revolution and Russia's withdrawal from the war. And so when the armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed on the 30th of October, 1918, British planners concluded that, to quote, their hands are now entirely free in regard to both the control of the Straits and the disposal of Constantinople. Factions inside and outside of government advocated multiple schemes for the city, which was alternatingly either to be annexed by Greece, internationalized, maybe as the seat of the new League of Nations, or made into a mandate, like the Ottoman territories in Iraq and Syria, that would be awarded to either Britain or the United States. But each of these solutions had its detractors. It was feared that international rule would be unwieldy. The Admiralty didn't want to invite the United States Navy into the Mediterranean, where they had dominated. It was feared that Greece would be insufficiently strong state to control this city. And opposition to each of these proposals was such that by the time that the terms of the future peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire were being finalized, a majority of the cabinet preferred instead to leave the city under Ottoman sovereignty. That is despite the determination of both the Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, to expel the Sultan and his government from Istanbul. But even this compromise did not resolve the status of the city, because the Treaty of Sevres, the treaty that came to be known, that was signed, between Britain, the other allies, and the Ottoman Empire, although it said that Istanbul would remain under Ottoman sovereignty, it's had a stipulation that this decision would be revised in the case that Turkey resisted the other clauses within the treaty, or if the Christian population of Anatolia would come under attack. So there was still this uncertainty around who would actually end up in Istanbul, who would end up in control, and who would actually physically be able to remain in the city. So while statesmen debated the future of Constantinople, its latest, June 1921, in the example on the screen, a complex military administration developed on the ground in response to the local situation. So whereas Curzon had claimed in 1918, before the end of the war, that, to quote, "no British government would dream of the assumption of so vast and perilous a charge as the administration of Constantinople," Britain was embarking, dreamlike, on exactly such a course. And the presence of this significant body of British and Allied forces in a large and complex city, and the imperialist mindset that officers with experience of service in Britain's formal and informal colonies brought with them, contributed to an ever-expanding logic of control. And indeed, control became the watchword of the occupation. It implied the ability to shape positively and negatively the environment that British servicemen found themselves in, but without the unwanted responsibilities of colonial administration. So as I try and show in the book, the fact that the occupation was temporary and until March 1920 entirely unofficial did not make it any less real or impactful. Rather than seeing the occupation as just one element in Britain's broader strategic position in the Middle East, I instead try and show how Britain's military presence impacted urban governance and the lived experience of the population of Istanbul. In the absence of definitive direction from London, it was British officers and servicemen on the ground who effected military rule and made it a reality for the population of the city. This decentralization of policymaking has shaped how I went about my research for the thesis. So alongside British, French, and Ottoman state archives, I also sought out the testimony of British servicemen and diplomatic officials who served in Istanbul in the period. And thanks to public interest in the First World War, there are large and well-resourced archives where the papers of many of these soldiers and diplomatic officials are concentrated, like in the University of Leeds, where the example on the screen, some photos that accompany a manuscript written by the British control officer Walter Miles, are archived. And in the book, there are references to more than 100 individual soldiers, sailors, and officials who came to the Ottoman Empire during the course of the First World War and its aftermath. And they range from generals to privates, from high commissioners to junior diplomats, but the majority were of middling rank, which reflects the kind of social class distortions in the keeping and depositing of recent records at the time. Academic interest in soldiers' writings had originally focused on what they could tell us about the factors that determined military outcomes, like battlefield morale, or what additional information they provided on the course of campaigns. But like other recent works, I was more interested in what these letters, diaries, and memoirs revealed about soldiers and sailors' understanding of the city that they found themselves and their behaviors away from the front lines, and how these impacted the local environment. So most British servicemen simply sought to fulfill their duties, keep themselves and their comrades safe, and enjoy their free time. But in doing so, their actions were no less central to the implementation and experience of imperial rule. Hygiene inspections of food cellars, or the disinfection of villages neighboring British encampments, drunken conversations and bar brawls, transactions with sex workers impacted a far greater number of Istanbul residents than the more widely remarked on arrest and deportation of Turkish nationalist leaders to Malta, for example. But it's those events that have dominated history writing about this period. Instead, in the book, I try and focus on what is usually termed everyday imperialism, the day-to-day interactions between the representatives of the British state and the local population. So in order to demonstrate how British impressions of the city were translated into policy, I'm going to examine two themes that form two of the core chapters of the book, the use of space and the use of time. So the initial sights that British soldiers and officials arriving in Istanbul had of the city, the first of whom reached is the Knife of the Golden Horn on the 13th of November 1918 as part of this victorious procession of a large Allied flotilla, was of the city from the water, which is a way of arriving in the city, a way of seeing the city that's now much less common. The picturesque silhouette of the city of Istanbul at a distance, like other main Mediterranean ports, was widely appreciated, as you can see in the following quotations. But these vistas eliminated from view the most troubling aspects of the city, not least its inhabitants. This depopulated, flattened city provided a pristine surface for the projection of imperial fantasies, such as in the second example, where Lieutenant Carus Wilson imagines that the sunset has removed the minarets that stand on either side of the Hagia Sophia. And the opposite view, the view of the anchored Allied fleet from the city, was equally widely remarked on, as you can imagine. Turkish, Armenian, and Greek writers and the censored letters written in the early weeks of the occupation demonstrate the diversity of feeling towards the arriving Allies. While some wished for revenge, others felt a sense of relief at the deliverance from the wartime government. This ambiguity over time solidified into a broader rejection on the part of the Turkish Muslim population of Istanbul of the Allied presence in the city. And we'll see some of the reasons that might have taken place, that transformation might have taken place. So entry into the peopled streets of the city broke its serenity as viewed from the water. In soldiers' testimony, we see feelings of visceral disgust, behind which stood the urge to reform the habits of the population and reshape the urban environment in ways conducive to British power. British authorities responded with efforts to control the circulation of individuals. And these are three of many, many reflections on the experience the British soldiers had walking the streets of Istanbul. You can see that their feelings were generally quite negative. And not very Lonely Planet worthy. There was a response which was to try and control the circulations of individuals within the city. So while Kennedy, for example, the second on the screen, his wish for a grand fire, did not come to pass as it had in Thessaloniki. But he enjoyed, to quote, searching all men he met in the dark, narrow streets and all those sitting in the wretched little cafes. Additional regulations removed vagrants from the city streets, tried to keep sex workers indoors, and limited the types of street vendors who could ply their trades. Rarely did these voices consider Britain's contribution to the problems that they were seeing around them, like housing shortages and homelessness that left so many people on the streets. One of the reasons for this was the widespread requisitioning of buildings for the purposes of billeting soldiers and the inflationary impact this had on rents in the city, for example. And requisitioning of properties became a major grievance of Turkish civilians, particularly wealthier property owners who made up the nationalist elite. A Turkish writer, Agassura Levent, asked, to quote, "How many people were left in the street without possession or an abode, their houses and together their possessions allotted to the comfort and pleasure of any officer?" And it wasn't only the human component of the urban environment against which Britons reacted, but also the physical conditions of the streets themselves. Against the regular lines, equal plots, and uniform hutments that made up British military camps, the winding streets of Constantinople stood in stark contrast. Rather than economic conditions or the peripheralization of the Ottoman economy or the strains of war, this state of decay was blamed on the Turkish character. As the example of Charles Taylor demonstrates. Now, given the historic symbolic significance of the city of Istanbul, Constantinople, such views opened the way to further British interventions in the control of urban heritage. The Church Times warned that, to quote, "the world is to lose yet another of its architectural wonders if British authorities did not intervene in the conservation of the Hagia Sophia, which would join, to quote, a wilderness of unrepaired buildings, houses, mosques, the debris of fire, or the outcome of neglect." And so the protection of these sites provided a further reason for the maintenance of some form of British or Allied control. As W.H. Hutton wrote to the Times, "The cities, to quote, magnificent monuments of ancient times need immediate and constant care such as the Turks never have given and never will give." The desire to return the Hagia Sophia to Christianity was tempered by a fear of the public reaction, particularly the impact that such a move would have on the Muslim population of Egypt and British India. As a result, the demands of this church-led campaign were resisted, an interesting parallel to a more recent and a successful campaign to convert the site from a museum back into a public mosque. Instead, British interventions focused on the infrastructural rather than the symbolic, guided by the need to make the city a major hub for power projection in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. British troops and war materials moved through the Bosphorus to southern Russia, where they supported anti-Bolshevik forces, and to the Caucasus, where British soldiers guarded the Baku to Batum oil pipeline and attempted to establish influence among the new states in the region. In Istanbul, as a result, Allied forces were quick to take over the administration of the ports, confiscating the Admiralty and Tophane artillery depots. And there, an inter-Allied passport bureau was established that both controlled entrance into the city and crucially provided documents for those wishing to depart, which would prove extremely useful for the onward journey of refugees from Russia and exiles seeking to flee the Ottoman Empire towards the end of the occupation. This model of international control of the city's ports and waterways was intended to be made permanent by the Treaty of Sevres, but as in many other areas, was abandoned by the time that the Treaty of Lausanne was agreed 3 years later. In this, the city was a failed example of one of a number of efforts at international administration, popular in places where no single imperial power held sway, like Shanghai or Tangier. So from these ports, British power radiated across Istanbul by means of its roads, which linked ports, barracks, and military camps. The occupation brought a major increase in the number of motor vehicles to the city streets, which resulted in an increasing number of traffic accidents and compensation claims for these litter French archives, for example. In response, the Allies instituted then novel concepts like number plates and speed limits in the city. Again, rather than acknowledging how demands brought by the occupation were impacting the city, the poor condition of the roads was blamed on the Turkish character. And again, the solution proposed was further foreign intervention. Allied authorities issued orders to the Ottoman government to repair the roads that led from Taksim to Dolmabahce and from Shishli to Maslak and Osmaniye, where there were British camps, and threatened to carry out the works themselves, billing the Ottoman government otherwise. And these piecemeal interventions whetted the appetite of many for a more comprehensive replanning of the city of Istanbul. Still, Orient News, the British newspaper in the city, noted, to quote, "Every Britisher has his head filled with plans for the improvement of our daily life in this city. But political uncertainty prevented the implementation of a more permanent solution." A British urban planner, Thomas Mawson, who narrowly lost out to the Frenchman Ernest Hebrard when replanning the Byzantine city of Thessaloniki, tried his luck with the municipality of Istanbul. But the British authorities quashed the plans, fearing that creating an urban plan for Istanbul would imply that the Turks were to remain owners of the city, which was as yet undecided. And Istanbul would have to wait until 1933 for the comprehensive urban plan proposed by Henry Prost. So the next theme of British intervention in Istanbul is that of time. The military occupation created new patterns for the use of time as much as it did for the use of space in Istanbul. Calls to prayer and religious festivals that were numerous in this multi-denominational city ran into the early hours of the morning, as did the opening hours of places of entertainment and leisure regulated and frequented by British troops. This routine jarred with that of the military camp, where almost the entire day, from morning roll calls to lights out, was strictly regulated in the name of military effectiveness. In response, Allied authorities imposed new schedules on the overlapping rhythms of the city and attempted to fill the time of men under their command with beneficial leisure activities. YMCA camps were established on the periphery of the city, where soldiers could enjoy swimming and other sports. A fox hunting club even operated from nearby British barracks in Maslak. And it was hoped that this martial sporting culture could be spread to locals through activities like the patronage of Boy Scouts associations by the British Colonel Maxwell. Some of these attempts would backfire, with sporting clubs becoming a medium of expression for nationalist and anti-colonial politics. Greek scout troops in the city became the subject of security concerns from the Ottoman authorities due to their potential paramilitary application. Football games in which local teams beat British military units were celebrated as moments of nationalist pride, such as the game depicted here, which was between a mixed British team and Fenerbahce, which led the Fenerbahce to win the so-called Harrington Cup, the trophy of which remains in the club's museum. Of greater concern to the authorities was the control and indulgence of nighttime leisure activities in Istanbul. The arrival of tens of thousands of foreign soldiers and sailors sent the city's existing nighttime sector into overdrive. The Orient News remarked how, to quote, "as by magic, English, Scotch, London, and Gibraltar bars sprang up everywhere." Agasseri Levant, the Turkish writer, likewise noted how, to quote, "every day a shop changes its wares, writing the name of a new saloon on the window." These bars played on the exotic associations of their location, such as one opened by British woman Bertha Proctor, which was remembered both for its English dance troupe, the so-called Lancashire Lasses, as well as, to quote, "beautiful maidens in Eastern costume with baggy trousers clasped around shapely ankles and golden slippers on bare feet." But it was more than just Orientalist pastiche that made up the nightlife of the city. The conditions of occupied Istanbul also allowed for experimentation in the avant-garde arts. Jazz music was heard for the first time, drawing on the talents of African-American sailors aboard US ships of war and the enterprise of Frederick Bruce Thomas, the Mississippi-born entrepreneur who had established a club in the city after his previous venture in Moscow ended in failure with the Russian Revolution. Thomas was just one of over 100,000 refugees who arrived in Istanbul at the time fleeing the Russian Civil War. And they opened numerous bars and cabarets, including other ventures by From Thomas, the longer enduring Maxim Club, Yuri Morphese's Strelna, Alex Vatinsky's Rose Noire. These latter two figures left memoirs that reveal the importance of the patronage of Allied officers and Ottoman elites, their efforts to avoid Turkish taxes, and their punishment at the hands of military authorities for breaking closing time regulations. So this entertainment sector that brought together Russian refugees with local entertainers and musicians and actors among the Allied soldiers, whose presence made the city an attractive touring destination. As the quote from Brigg at the top suggests, the impression left on audiences was one of an exaggerated cosmopolitanism. While at times this was celebrated, it's worth noting that the broader British impression of the multicultural and multi-ethnic city that they encountered, a concept that was far from having been established in mainland Britain, was largely negative. The association between nocturnal corruption and the minority population of the city was something that British authorities shared with their Turkish nationalist rivals, and would remain a major theme of Turkish literature and thought into the Republic. In order to control nocturnal activities in the occupied city, compulsory closing times were established. But doing so was a huge bureaucratic task, which generated hundreds of documents as the owners of bars, restaurants, and theatres sought to secure extensions and exemptions, whose businesses were then the subject of intelligence gathering by the inter-allied police. There's a petition there on the left by the owner of the famous Novotny bar, and on the right, an intelligence report by a French policeman reporting that, thankfully, the bar he was investigating did not attract women de mauvaise vie, who have had a bad, how would you translate that? Women, well, low women, let's say. But the same Allied soldiers who policed nightlife and its regulations were often found to be in breach of them. Regular drunken fights saw soldiers of different Allied nations brawling on the streets of Istanbul. At the Étoile Palace, a group of around 20 French army officers became engaged in a fight with 6 Americans, who were badly beaten, being struck with plates and a weighted riding crop, until 2 revolver shots dispersed the crowd and the British military police arrived. This is just one of many, many examples of nighttime disturbances involving Allied soldiers. Others were directed towards Ottoman civilians and officials. For example, on the night of 2nd of December 1918, Ottoman police stationed in Eminonu encountered 8 French soldiers and 2 local Christian women. One of them was crawling on the ground and, to quote, drunk to the last degree. When the Ottoman police officer offered the woman a cab ride, he was met with threats from the French soldiers who drew their bayonets and was only rescued when Ottoman soldiers arrived at the scene. These kind of scenes provoked a predictable reaction among the Turkish population. In October 1923, the prohibition of alcohol, already in place in Anatolia, was applied to the city. And while conservative voices championed the restoration of nighttime order, others began to wax nostalgic almost immediately, as you can see in the following piece from the newspaper Tannin. Such depictions of nightlife became symbolic of the occupation era, now transformed into a more general nostalgia for the cosmopolitan past, which has been seen in recent TV shows such as the Netflix series The Club. So after becoming so embedded in governance and the daily and nightly life of the occupied city, the extraction of the British military from Istanbul could only be complex and painful. After the Turkish nationalist victory over Greek forces in Anatolia in August 1922, transfer of power within the Ottoman capital appeared inevitable. But whether this would be peaceful or otherwise remained in question. Mustafa Kemal gave an interview to the British journalist Ward Price in the newly recaptured Izmir, expressing his preference for a negotiated settlement on the basis of the National Pact, while warning him that if the Allies refused to hand over Constantinople, he would capture the city by force, to quote, an affair of only a few days. Holding the city against a Turkish attack was deemed impossible. Charles Harrington set plans for evacuation within a week of Turkish advance being detected, as any longer would allow time for Turkish howitzers to be brought to bear on the Bosphorus. In the space of a few months, the city appeared to have been transformed from the center of control of the wider region into a trap where, to quote, instead of holding Constantinople as a pledge, we ourselves should be in the position of hostages. In the event of evacuation, authorities anticipated a mass exodus. The British head of the Allied Police Commission feared, to quote, another case of Smyrna, where hundreds of thousands of civilians had fled amid looting, arson, and murder under the watch of Allied ships. Britain's senior naval officer was told to prepare for the evacuation of 5,000 British subjects and feared up to 500,000 local inhabitants might also seek to flee. In the event, the desire to avoid war on both sides prevailed, leaving negotiators willing to make concessions during armistice talks at Madania in October 1922 and the longer agreement of a final treaty at Lausanne that began in December. The successful negotiation of these treaties has disguised the extent of control that Britain had established and anticipated maintaining in Istanbul and the wider Ottoman Empire. The headline exemption of the Christian population of Istanbul, secured at Lausanne from the population exchange, has also obscured the disruptiveness of the transition of power for the city's Greek and Armenian Orthodox and opponents of the Ankara government of all religious persuasions. Amid the negotiations, the arrival of Ankara's representative, Refet Bele, whose arrival is celebrated in the photo on the right-hand side, initiated a period of dual authority that was particularly uneasy. Departures from the city began almost immediately. They included individuals from across a broad social spectrum. At the top stood the Sultan himself, who left on a British ship to Malta on the 17th of November 1922. Another example would be Patriarch Zaven, the head of the Armenian Orthodox Church, who left on the 12th of December, brought with a British-issued passport onto a commercial ship headed to Bulgaria. And British authorities also considered evacuating the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Meletios, but he remained in the city until departing for Greece in July 1923, as the community sought to accommodate themselves with the new Ankara authorities. Many less well-known Christians followed suit. Lord Curzon at Lausanne suggested that 15,000 had already left the city in October 1922, and at the time of his appearance in early December, that some 3,000 were leaving each day. They included large numbers of orphans being cared for by allied charities such as the Lord Mayor's Fund, who, finding relocation to England unsuitable, evacuated children in their care to Corfu. The photo on the left shows one of the orphan ships, Armenian orphans brought from Samsun, who, after initially planning to remain in Istanbul, given this changing strategic situation, were also evacuated to Greece. Further evacuations were improvised for Turkish Muslims who were through their cooperation with the Allies or hostility to the Ankara government were judged unsafe to remain. After the lynching of the pro-British former minister and journalist Ali Kamal, numerous people connected to his Liberal Party and others who had worked as British agents sought refuge in British barracks. Some 145 such figures were evacuated to Greece and from there to former Ottoman territories in the Balkans and Middle East, where some of them would go on to form important opposition voices to the early Turkish Republic. In all, a total of some 100,000 individuals from all communities were estimated to have left the city between the end of 1922 until the end of 1923. The move of the capital from Istanbul to Ankara on the 13th of October, shortly after the Allied departure, and the institution of new regulations governing tax and workplace employment further depressed the economy of the city. This outpouring of people and the Allied withdrawal has resulted in the dispersal of memoirs and archives about pre-1923 Istanbul around the world. While it's perhaps the best documented period in the city's history, access to these materials is complicated by issues of language and location. And whatever my efforts, I've always felt that it's an impossible task for a single individual to tell the story of Istanbul under occupation. So I'm pleased to have been involved since the publication of the book in several collaborative projects examining the city from multiple angles. So together with Gizem Tongo and with the collaboration of dozens of colleagues with various specializations, we've prepared this bibliography for the study of the city in the period that includes archival materials, memoirs, and academic works in local and international languages. In the new year, the first exhibition on the occupation will open under our curation at the Istanbul Research Institute. As in the bibliography, our aim has been to show the multiplicity of voices and the variety of reactions and outcomes that flowed from the act of the city's occupation, using photographs, paintings, historical documents, newspapers, and contemporary publications, some of which have appeared in the slides in today's lecture. This exhibition coincides with the 100th anniversary of the Allies' evacuation, known in Turkish as the Festival of the City's Liberation, on the 6th of October 2023. This centennial, and that of the official occupation of Istanbul on 16th of March 2020, has inspired increasing interest in this once neglected field. Multiple workshops and conferences on the subject have brought together a large group of scholars working on the period, whose cooperation should be resulting in additional publications. But it's uncertain whether these efforts will reshape public understanding of the occupation in Turkey, where the prevailing paradigm is still dominated by the narrative of oppression and resistance, in which more nuanced connections and encounters in the city are lost. And it's equally uncertain if the appearance of these new publications about the occupation in English will lead to British acknowledgement of its past ambitions for colonial control in the city and the insidious ways by which unequal systems of law and privilege shaped soldiers' behavior and the experience of subjugation. While political trends are not promising, it's worth recalling that the bitterness of 2022 is still a far cry from the enmity of a century ago. Thank you.